You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez.
In 2018, the U.S. Census made a pretty shocking prediction. We were staring down a silver wave. A huge number of people will be turning 65, and by 2034, there will be more elderly Americans than children under 18 in this country. The demographic shift will have a profound and maybe disruptive effect on this country and around the world. I remember reading about this and wondering, what's this gray new world going to be like for me and the people I care about the most as we age?
Let's see, how old will I be? I'll be in my mid-70s in 2040. No, I'll be in my mid-80s. I was never very good at math. I'll be in my mid-80s in 2040.
But you'll feel like you're in your mid-70s.
That's right.
That's Joe Coughlin, the founder and director of MIT's Age Lab. Joe and his team research new ways to make aging a better experience.
Well, hopefully, yes. What do I have to look forward to? What do we all have to look forward to since I was born in the year when more Americans were born than any other birth year until the 21st century? What's going to change?
You're going to see a lot more technology in old age, not simply to remind you to take your meds or measure your blood pressure, but actually enabling you perhaps to stay in your home longer, to bring information to you, to make things more convenient. Imagine the following: products and services that are not just for kids anymore, but experiences that include fashion and fun and maybe even friends, bringing it to you as a way of inventing an entirely new life stage. Imagine starting to create these new opportunities and new things that celebrate people after 60, 70, 80, and 90, to start to add order, happiness, and engagement across the lifespan, not just in one part of your life alone.
A few years ago, Joe was witnessing a new generation gap. In other words, baby boomers were demanding more out of life, more products, more experiences, because we're living longer and better than those before us. There's no way Coughlin could have predicted we were headed for a pandemic, a global event that would reset everything about how we live our lives. And for the last couple of years, we've talked about COVID-19 and health. But how has the pandemic changed how we age? And what can we look forward to as we move beyond lockdowns and restrictions? While it's true most of us are living longer and healthier than the generations before us, who's going to take care of us when we get old? What is old going to mean for our families? Can rapid advancement in technology help us take care of ourselves longer? To answer these questions, we recently invited Joe back to see if he's still optimistic about our health futures.
Joseph Coughlin, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
It's great to be here, Ray. Thank you for having me.
Well, you were last on the program several years ago, and in the intervening years, we had a global drill, straining systems in the richest and poorest countries in the world. We were faced with a disease that older people were more vulnerable to, that older people were more likely to die from, and that particularly stressed systems already struggling. How did we do?
Well, we certainly found the cracks, let's put it that way. Indeed, you're right. The pandemic and everything around it was effectively a fire drill for your own retirement and a stress test for our institutions. And I think we did not do nearly as well as we had hoped, because although we know that we're all going to get older with any luck, because the alternative is not nearly as pretty, institutions, companies, governments, and frankly, even individuals have done a pretty poor job at planning for the inevitable. We saw that healthcare was insufficient. We found that caregiving at a distance was a challenge. We found that older folks are often left on their own.
I saw both my mother-in-law and my father in his 80s, my mother-in-law in her 90s, struggle acutely with how the pandemic shifted their routines, forced them into being by themselves a lot more of the time. It was tough.
Yeah, it absolutely was tough. I mean, think about it. Older adults were already suffering pre-pandemic from a virtual epidemic of social isolation and loneliness. And frankly, we even know that loneliness is not just a feeling, it has the medical impact of smoking 11 to 15 cigarettes per day.
What about upsides? Were there some things we learned on the fly, some things we tested, rolled out, that give us intelligence that we can apply when we talk about keeping people healthy longer and living longer lives?
Look, I am a rabid optimist, so I do believe we are coming out stronger at the end of the pandemic. And here's a couple reasons why. One, I think that we saw those cracks and we're trying to patch them up. We're trying to rethink our institutions and processes and ways that we connect with our family. I think a lot of us have a new revelation of what is truly important, which are our friends, our family, our connections. That's one thing. But also on the technology. My own team here at the MIT Age Lab was doing surveys consistently through the height of the pandemic. And believe it or not, we found that technology became the new toilet paper. That while in March people were out there buying pallet loads of toilet paper, they were also buying smart speakers and devices and cameras to ways to connect, to provide service and the like. And frankly, we're always making fun of younger generations. That's what all older generations do. Everyone takes their turn in the bucket, if you will. You know how we were making fun of Gen Z and the younger millennials of like everything gets delivered. You don't own your own car. You do everything by app. Well, guess what? Doing life by app became the new assisted living. In fact, it became so cool, so convenient that now everybody wants to do it. So those crazy kids, they weren't so crazy.
Well, when my brother taught my father how to use FaceTime, I knew we were in new territory. But part of it was, in my particular case, the siblings who lived closest to him also had public-facing jobs where before vaccination, they just couldn't take the risk of being around him and bringing coronavirus home. So more and more, they started to do things by phone, and he wanted to be able to see his kids.
And to that point, we've always had this great mythology out there for decades that older people don't like technology, they don't trust it, they can't use it. My dad, my mom, they just don't get it. To be honest with you, the findings we've done here at the Age Lab and elsewhere find that no, it's basically, does the technology provide a value that's high enough to be the threshold for my money, my time, and my hassle? In the pandemic, just as you're describing, your family situation found that older adults stepped up and actually started to adopt technology because, oh, wait a minute, this wasn't just about doing video games or shopping. Now this is my way of connecting. And I don't want to lead anyone astray. I don't believe that high tech will ever replace high touch, but when touch is not available, high tech stepped in.
One of the most complicated parts of touch was at-home healthcare, which was a system that was already threadbare before the novel coronavirus arrived. And now people had to be creative. They had to also take tremendous risks. How do we manage our way? How do we create our way? How do we innovate our way out of some of the real shortages that showed up during this period?
Absolutely. We have a tremendous workforce crisis, and everyone's thinking, well, that's the result of the pandemic or economic conditions. No. This has been happening long before the pandemic. There has been a shortage in healthcare workers, in healthcare in general, and home care workers. Think about it. The person taking care of your elderly mother living at home, the competition is either the job of caring for your mom in the way that you hope she cares for her, or getting a job at fast food or driving for Uber. The economics are the same. So if you're that care worker who may be confronted with disease and crazy transportation problems and frankly not great pay, you're going to drop your mom like a hot potato and flip burgers at McDonald's. And so as a nation, we need a coming together to understand where do we want to put our resources, what are our priorities, and how do we value and pay and train the people that will be caring for your mother.
Was this a big enough event to change the profile, or something that we eventually just shake off and continue our headlong charge to a later 21st century where there's just a lot more gray heads around?
I think that what you're going to see is that there is going to be a shakeup and a change. The technology role is here to stay. I think the idea that grandma and grandpa don't like tech in their home is over. Heck, telemedicine, which has been around as a concept, believe it or not, since the 1890s, was written up in a British journal called The Lancet as a concept when the telephone was invented. It took a pandemic and 120 years to actually get it into people's lives. Those things will stick, and the memories of this will stick, particularly in younger generations' minds. I told you, I'm a rabid optimist. I teach urban planning here at MIT and students from Harvard and whatnot, and we're starting to see the market speak up. So-called livable communities, or age-friendly, I prefer to say age-ready communities, places that you can walk and have the intensity and density and accessibility to have fun, to reach out, to have chance collisions with new people. Guess what? Those places are now being designed, developed, and built in high-end neighborhoods. Now what we need to do is to push that down for the rest of us. So it's no longer going to be about the mall under roof. It's going to be about that town center that was once all traffic to be more walkable, to have cafes, places that allow us to have that third place, as they call it, to hang out and meet new people. That helps younger people, and it certainly helps older people who've been isolated.
Well, Joe Coughlin, you've talked me off the ledge. My useful reporterly pessimism ran smack head-on into your restless optimism. So I thank you for that. Great to talk to you again.
Great to be here, Ray. Thank you so much. And you know something? Tomorrow will be better because we'll make it so. Take care.
Our aging world is one of the most important stories of the decade. While advancements in healthcare are helping people live longer, more fulfilling lives, several countries face the threat of limited, inadequate services as the aged strain health systems. The starkest examples may be Japan, Italy, and South Korea, where together nearly 40% of the population will be over 65 by 2050. And Japan is a particularly interesting case study, because where the world will be by mid-century, Japan already is.
In fact, has been for some time. Oldest median age, largest portion of the population over 60, largest share of the population living to be 100. With longevity pulling on one end of the statistical formulas and a low birth rate pushing on the other end, Japan's population is shrinking as the world's population keeps getting larger. To talk about the challenges the country is faced with aging, we're joined by Motoko Rich, Tokyo bureau chief of the New York Times.
Thanks for having me.
Does a society that's older register when you're on the street, when you're in a market, when you're waiting for a train? Does it take a while to notice?
No, it does not take a while to notice at all. It's everywhere from, like you said, when you're walking on the street or particularly on the trains, you see elderly walking around. And it's sort of two things that strike me. One is either that, wow, the longevity is part of the reason why a large proportion of the population is over 65 here. And they're very healthy. They've been, walking around and taking public transit their whole lives. So they're still quite, as we use the word in Japan, genki, very healthy and vibrant. On the other hand, you also see people that you think, wow, they're kind of bent over, going very slowly with walkers. And you think, wow, this person should be resting and not having to go on the transit. But then everywhere you look, so say you go into a city hall, there are usually little hooks to put your cane next to the counters when you go up to see the clerk. If you go into a bank, there are often sort of 3 different sets of reading glasses on the counter where you fill out your deposit slip. There are all kinds of signs, certain seats in places for the elderly. It just feels like a society that is set up for old people.
Some countries are squeamish about talking about mortality and cost and public policy. Has Japan's demographic profile forced them to have a frank discussion of how government and other entities spend money?
That's a really good question, and I don't think that frank discussion has happened yet. There is an obvious sort of upside down structure now, upside down pyramid to the economy. The pension system was built at a time when the population was growing and there were enough young people to be paying into it to sustain the retirees, and that's now upside down. So there are more people who need to collect pensions than there are people to pay into it. And there's not yet been a frank discussion about what to do about that and whether there's going to be intergenerational inequity as a result of that. On the other hand, the national pension system, while there is sort of like a social security-like pension in Japan, it's very minimal. So it's pretty hard for people to live. If they're only eligible for the basic pension, it's sort of less than $500 a month. It's really hard for a retiree to live on that. Japan also used to have a kind of work for life culture where people would enter companies upon their graduation and stay there until they retired, and then they could get pensions associated with that. But that system is starting to break down, where an increasing proportion of the population works in freelance or contract jobs, which don't have as good benefits. So these are all conversations that are going to need to be had.
Even with a healthy elderly population, a national health system has to provide a different range of services and has to divvy out its money in a different way when you're looking at the kind of demographic profile that Japan has. A large number of people entering what could be the most expensive period of their lives in healthcare terms. Is that system under strain as well?
Absolutely. And I think that's also a conversation that people are a little bit hesitant to have. How much care should be provided and how will they provide it? It's not just a financial issue. It's actually a workforce issue. As more and more people grow older and need intensive care, they need a workforce to provide that care. And because the fertility rate is so low, there just aren't enough young people to fill the jobs in nursing homes, hospitals, other facilities where people might need to go to get care. And that is a huge question that Japan still has yet to reckon with. Before the pandemic, the laws were changed to allow more foreign workers to come into the country. These were people who would have special visas to stay for 5 and only 5 years. They wouldn't be allowed to bring their families. They were discouraged from getting married and having children and setting down roots in Japan. So it was sort of like a temporary labor force that they were looking to expand slightly. I mean, there are conversations that have occurred here where they talk about, AI or automation or robots will save the way, will become more efficient, more women will come into the workforce. And there are sandwich generations, people who are themselves older, who are taking care of even older parents. I know of people who are now retiring at age 65 in order to take care of their parents into their 90s. And that seems to be the slightly naive vision that policymakers talk about, that families will still take care of their families, despite the fact that what young people there are in Japan tend to, if they are born in rural prefectures, move towards Tokyo or Osaka, some of the bigger cities. They're not living with or near their parents anymore. So a lot of the proposals are unrealistic. So I think you're absolutely right that they need to have a more serious conversation about how they're going to fix this problem.
As I got ready to do this interview, I was looking over a great number of articles, and I read one of yours about perhaps a less obvious but maybe predictable outcome of this kind of demographic anomaly: the change in disposable sanitary products. Japan now uses more adult diapers for incontinence than ones for babies, and they're producing 1.5 million tons of waste a year, and they had to figure out what to do. What are some of the solutions?
Yeah, no, it's a pretty striking statistic, right? That there are more adult diapers than baby diapers. And waste management is a big deal in Japan because it's a culture that mostly incinerates its waste. It's one of the highest incineration rates in the OECD or developed economies. And one of the solutions that I found in a small aging prefecture is that instead of just simply burning the diapers, they're recycling them. And what they do is they turn them into these they kind of of burn them down or melt them down, if you will, into these little tiny pellets that are then used as a heat source. So the idea is to both reduce the waste, to also reduce the carbon emissions produced by incinerating them, and also to reduce carbon emissions in the fuel use. So the place where I went, they were using them to heat up hot spring baths. So in the furnace, instead of using something like coal or oil or even natural gas, they're using these little pellets that are produced from recycled diapers. It seems kind of gross, but I even took a bath in the hot springs where the water had been heated by these pellets and talked to some people there, and they're like, oh, sounds like a good idea. I don't feel bad about it.
Well, it's an example of, I guess, the kind of adaptation that a society would have to make in 100 ways, large and small. Are there new foods? Are there new social gatherings? Are there new forms of entertainment? When you're looking at a third of your population over 65, when you're looking at a median age close to 50, maybe it's a different kind of place to live in as well.
Yeah, well, I'm close to 50 myself, and I feel young here, which is great. But when you talk about different kinds of foods, I once did a story about restaurants that were accommodating older customers who were no longer able to chew. And so they were coming up with these menus of entirely pureed foods, because chewing is one of those abilities that deteriorates over time, especially if you don't have good dental work in your younger years. And so they would, take regular tasty Japanese, lunch sets and puree everything and put it back on the tray and serve them at the restaurant.
Some of the countries that are becoming older quickly, that are following Japan's demographic model, are not as rich as Japan. Are there initiatives, programs, responses that are available to the Japanese because they're rich, that may be tougher for the new old, also rapidly aging, but less wealthy?
Well, I think you talked about healthcare, right? That if you're a wealthy country that has a nationalized health system, that most people know that at a bare minimum, they're not going to be left sitting outside an ER begging for care. They know that if they have some basic illness or infirmity, that they are going to get care. There are still quite a lot of systems in which local municipalities will offer home visitors, all kinds of support, dementia classes. I've been to community centers where there are yoga classes or various classes going on for older people. And I think if you don't have money in your tax coffers to support that, it's very hard to provide all those services. Even when I talk about the minor little things like places to hook your cane or reading glasses in the banks or extra seats in public transit, all of that costs money. And if you don't, as a society, have that or prioritize respect for the age, that can be quite difficult.
Is a planet that's hotter in the summer, in some places colder in the winter, wetter in many places, also a tougher place to grow old? We're talking in the midst of a summer that's setting all kinds of bad records all over the planet.
Absolutely. Before the pandemic, I would have said that was 100% the biggest risk for people over 65, right? That heat stroke was a big problem. A few summers ago, Japan recorded record heats around Tokyo and in a nearby suburb, and there were unfortunately quite a lot of deaths from heat stroke among the elderly. Obviously, the pandemic has been a very, very gruesome and sobering reminder of how vulnerable the older population can be to various environmental and virus-caused diseases and problems.
One thing that the pandemic drove here in the United States is an already existing loneliness epidemic, with chronic loneliness being one of the drivers of so-called deaths of despair. A big percentage of over 65s in Japan are living alone. Is there the same kind of loneliness problem there?
100%. And I think what is particularly striking for a place like Japan, and I think this might be true across Asia, is that typically, or traditionally, I should say, there has been a culture of multi-generational living and caregiving, that the assumption had always been that you would live with several generations, that the parents would take care of the children and grandchildren, and that at some point that would reverse, that the adult children would take care of their parents. But that structure has been upended by urbanization. Up until this year, Tokyo was still growing in population largely because of people moving in from the prefectures, and those are young people. So they're leaving behind their aged parents. There also are these phenomenons of people living alone, either because a spouse has died or because they were never married to begin with, or they're estranged, or some issue has come up. And my colleague Norimitsu Onishi wrote about this a few years back, about this very sad phenomenon of people living alone in these mass apartment complexes and dying on their own for lack of anyone coming to care for them.
Well, Motoko Rich, the country, as we've discussed, already has a huge number of centenarians. These trends for aging continue apace with nothing on the horizon that seems to be pushing in the other direction. There's never been anything like it before. In sum, as we close, overall, would you say Japan is managing really to become the first country of its kind in the history of the world, but still figuring it out?
I mean, I think still figuring it out is absolutely right. And Japan as a culture is a place where they don't tend to have radical change. Everything is incremental and there's a lot of preparation. If there's some kind of dramatic change that needs to happen, there's an enormous amount of preparation beforehand. So the optimistic view is that we're in the preparation stage, and that when they get to the point where they need to implement a lot of policies, they'll be ready and they'll do them and they'll be very efficient about it. The flip side is that, like you said, this is a historic moment. Nobody has ever gone through this ever before. And so then the question becomes the things that worked before, the way that they make change here, will that work in the future? And so, yes, there's a glass half full and a glass half empty view of all of this. So far, it seems to be working, but we've got a few more decades to go yet before we know if it has truly worked.
Motoko Rich is the Tokyo bureau chief for the New York Times. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with support from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Matteo Schimpf, Elise Manukian, and Andrew Stelzer. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional engineering support was provided by Rob Spate. Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club and World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.